Hello and welcome to part 7 of 7 of the Long Patrol. Now on 1920s and 1930s aircraft carriers. Now, while you've been watching this, I've probably been going through and editing them in terms of the end screen to make sure they link up with each other. Because sometimes when I do that before they go live, they get a bit funny on the end screen. So that's been fun. And I'm going to try something a little bit different. In that I'm going to look at some of the questions which have come through as part of this conclusion on part of the videos which have already gone live, which is why I saved this to be recorded on Tuesday. Now, of course, I'm not going to get through all of the questions. Mainly because I'm recording this before I start teaching for the day, and that I've got a small break before 3 o'clock. And so I'm recording this roughly at 1 o'clock. So only episodes 1, 2, 3, and 4 have gone live at this point. So any questions which come up which I feel are better dealt with me by me talking rather than me, how do I put this, writing a reply in the comments, will be dealt with on the Brew Ships episode this coming weekend. So that'll be Brew Ships 32, if anyone's hunting for them. So, without much further ado, what's the conclusion? Well, it's not really much of a surprise, considering you've listened to my discussions the whole way through. You've heard me talking about it. What are aircraft carriers in the 1920s and 30s? Well, I would argue very strongly that the idea that they take up a position as a capital ship in World War II, that they don't become a capital ship to World War II, is wrong. And I understand where that comes from, but you have to remember this is a different world we're talking about. In that a lot of the people who'd kind of grown up who were in command positions were used to the concept of first class, second class, and third class battleships. We're used to the concept of first, second, and third class cruisers. We're used to the concept of battleships and battle cruisers. And whilst some, certainly in terms of capital ship, did not include the carriers, Sir John Parker, some certainly did, Stanley Goodall, Admiral Henderson. And I would argue a fair number more. They offer information, range, and adaptability. Their air group is the primary asset. And, for example, the Joffre was going to have a twin-engined aircraft as its torpedo bomber reconnaissance aircraft. That would have been an absolute game changer. Yes, there would have been issues with its hangar, and its flight deck, and everything about its operation, but the aircraft would have been cool. And trust me, if that had come through in peacetime, very quickly other navies would have had to adapt. And with the treaties breaking down as they were in 1938 already, would not have been surprised if the flight decks and the lifts and the hangars on the carriers in production, given that if it had been still in peacetime, would have had significant modifications made to them to accommodate twin-engined aircraft. There would have been an adaptation and evolution of the designs going through. For some navies, that would have been easier than others. The Americans and the Japanese, with the flight deck not being their strength deck, that would have been easier. For the Royal Navy, it would have required calculations. But also the Royal Navy, if you think about it at this point, by the end of the 1930s, has illustrious in production, but let's be honest, she's going to be commissioned in 1940, so she's not exactly that easy to do. But has 3 of her sisters, one a subclass, and Indomitable and Implacable. No, Indefatigable and Implacable. Indomitable's one of Illustrious Assistants. Coming along. They have 6 carriers in close production. If you think they couldn't change them on the stocks, then you have no idea how good a naval architect Stanley Goodall was. So they would have. Range. If your primary focus is economic warfare, your carrier starts to become a capital ship of the economic warfare. And I would argue one of the reasons why the Royal Navy coming up to the Second World War has been so tardy in upgrading and renewing Hood and Repulse is because they've already started to be how do I put this? Started to be displaced as the primary economic warfare asset in, well, here is the combo. Force H. That is your economic area control rapid reaction force. It has a battle cruiser, not upgraded, but could well have been a fast battleship, which they were building some of. It has a strike carrier, one of the larger carriers the Royal Navy has available. One of the ones which certainly could have been, thanks to the strength and shape of our hull, probably could have been adapted to take twin-engine aircraft, at least in the upper hangar. And a town-class cruiser. There is no wonder that such an organization gets formed and it gets used for such duties. So what they develop in the period? Catapults, arrestor cables, barriers, lifts, beacons, and radar starts to come along. Beacons are critical because it allows your aircraft to start operating a longer range. If you started operating a longer range, you then need a navigator to help get you back within the vicinity of the beacon. That's why you end up with 2-seater fighters with the Royal Navy, because in a way, every aircraft is a strike aircraft. And especially pre-radar, how much early warning you're going to have of enemy attackers is open to debate. Hence the armored deck. Especially true in the Mediterranean, but also in the RN's case, I have this suspicion that because it'd be what they would have done if they'd been in a similar situation, they had a strong, nothing written down, but almost institutional memory and culture understanding that what the Japanese might do with Pearl Harbor. But they expected it to be any fleet which was in Singapore. Because, again, this is the Royal Navy. We're talking about the service which are made Copenhagening a verb. To Copenhagen someone. We're also talking about a navy which had been allied with the Japanese for a long time and had watched what they did at Port Arthur. Proof they wouldn't have had. Not enough to probably justify their views to any government. But suspicions amongst the officers who served in the Far East, and even the officers who didn't, would have probably been quite strong. And it's kind of interesting because in both scenarios, the British perspective, both the ones who knew and respected the Japanese and those who didn't respect the Japanese, would play into support of the thinking like that and thinking along those as being possible lines. I.e., the officers who did know the Japanese knew how capable they were, respected them, understood them to an extent. As much as you can. The officers who were dismissive of the Japanese because, they copy everything, would either put it down to potentially the Japanese copying Britain, after all, what we did at Copenhagen, and alternatively, oh, damn, cowardly, da 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 da. Of course, they'll attack us by surprise. It's the only chance they have to win against us. So it's one of those scenarios where actually the Royal Navy psyche would work an advantage. And you have to look at the other navies and go, you were surprised by this? The thing is, I think that's also one of the reasons why the Royal Navy is so reluctant to put Force Z where they do put Force Z. Because they're sort of going, it's Singapore. It's not defended because you guys haven't been putting the money. We've been asking for funding for defense, and that's one of the great things about reading that China Station book. You find the Royal Navy starts asking for money to build defences in Singapore in 1919. 1919. 1941 happens, and they're sort of going, I wanted a proper system of defence, especially when they stuck in the causeway. Amazingly, the causeway was built asked for later and built and completed all before they actually had the defences. Can't think why. But that doesn't really get to carriers. I'd also like to point out the different strands of carrier development you see coming through. And again, my advice is never to be drawn into those dichotomies where people go, this was right and that was wrong. The question you have to ask yourself, was it right for the nation involved? I would argue the Graf Zeppelin and the Bern, and possibly the Joffre, were not correct for the nations which were asking for them, but showed how deeply those nations were thinking about the subject. But the trouble is they were going down an engineering echo chamber rather than having the operational experience. And I really do wonder if the French had had a slightly better carrier than the Bern, whether the Joffre might have been a lot better. And I seriously think that if the Germans had built a carrier prior to World War II, operated it, the second carrier would have been a lot better. And I think a lot of the systems, which were brilliant engineering solutions, would disappear for far more, how do I put this, mundane but practical systems. Because they work great on paper and they look absolutely amazing, but they have their problems. And this is not to say that the American, Japanese, and British carriers did not have problems. They did. Huge ones. The British carriers were designed on too small a tonnage, which is why they start to look really good once you get to Indefatigable and Implacable. And those are really good designs. But even they could have done with a few more tons. Because the armored flight deck makes sense. The armored hangar, arm box makes the systems the British were building makes their carriers incredibly survivable. It makes a lot of sense for a nation which is worried about its capacity to repair and rebuild more quickly because it's still building up its shipyards. Remember when I talked about the 1889 Naval Defense Act and how that laid the groundwork for the build-up and the mass production in World War One. Think about the 1920s and 1930s. There's a Great Recession. There's a consolidation of the shipbuilding industry. There is a huge reduction, thanks to the treaties and 10-year rules and various cost-cutting in warship production. It all has an impact on yards. Some will now point out the American production schedule. Yes, but the Americans had 2 more years to prepare for war. That helped them. It helped them a lot. Those 2 extra years cannot be discounted. If Britain had had 2 more years, who knows what it would have achieved. The same with Japan, strange enough. Their hand is forced in 1941. Never discount that. Their hand was forced. I have no doubt there would have been war, but 1941 is not a good time for them to go for it. They're consolidating themselves in French Indochina. They are dealing with issues in Manchuria. And frankly, they know they haven't managed to build up enough yet. If they had had the economy to carry on, is a whole different debate, but they need at least 2 or 3 more years to actually get the preparations to where they wanted. But those preparations were dependent, rather like the Germans of the naval race era prior to World War One, were dependent upon basically the British and the Americans standing still. If the British and Americans didn't stand still, they did keep building new stuff, then they were in trouble. And it all comes down to aircraft carriers, because they're the offset strategy. They're the unknown quantity because of that range factor. You see, if it's a numbers battle, then the side with the most battleships will win if you keep fighting. Unless you can offset it, the British famously feared a torpedo attack, a mass torpedo attack that would reduce their superiority of numbers and therefore allow the Germans an advantage in Jutland and various other things. But the thing is, you're turning into a mathematical equation. But carriers with the range, you might well be able to strike the enemy and they don't know where you are. Or you can do a British one and you can strike at night when they can't fly. So it doesn't matter. Well, they definitely don't know where you are, and it doesn't matter if they outnumber you. You can do all that from a range they can't hit back at you from. That's why carriers become capital ships. And navies know this. All 3 of the big navies have been doing these exercises. The only navy which possibly hasn't been managing these exercises is the poor French. But I'm sure they're trying. So, let's consider some questions. Going to make sure I'm up to date with all the latest questions as of 1:30. Right then. Ooh, there's been a lot. Let's start off with Yickers. I'm sorry you were 37 minutes late going to bed. Wayne Borean. Hello. Hope I didn't get you stuck. You're getting your sleep for too long. HMS Ford, you're up early. I was asleep. Shane F. Right then. Let's see. Shane F. Was having the usual early morning. Get back from my morning circuit and I find the first part of a long patrol. Looks like Tuesday was fun. Yeah. So glad to hear this, as I dozed off another night at the... Okay. Nice joke. Bruce Marino. Looking forward to following this closely. I've always been interested in why autogyros were not more used. Some German subs act notwithstanding. Also, would it be fair to say that the aircraft were the real weapons and were much... were much easier to upgrade than main guns? Well, I've said this in a few other videos, but they were definitely much easier to upgrade than main guns, although there were efforts which had to be involved in them. And autogyros weren't used because they just weren't that reliable at this point. There are lots of potential for autogyros to go, and knowing what we do about helicopters, it seems rather silly, but that's looking at how the technology's turned out. At the time, they are mainly oddities, despite what some people said in replies to various papers at the Institute of Naval Architects. As Carl van Gasbeck has replied and said, one either had to ditch the craft and properly even the pilot if attacked by a proper airplane or risk diving. Anonymous, I should be studying Russian. Oh, look, part 207. And you send a link to the Spanish seaplane carrier at Wikipedia. Yeah, Spain had a seaplane carrier, but I am not getting into the seaplane carriers. They are a whole different kettle of fish, really, and something which shouldn't, again, be discounted. One of the things I don't like is when people automatically discount seaplane carriers and the operations they do. They do some really cool stuff, and they are really critical to so many little things. Mainly it's this: the seaplane carrier is considered as a mobile depot ship for your seaplanes. So kind of like your destroyers and your submarines. You send it somewhere, you have got the facilities you need to support them in a random bay or port, which has might have no other infrastructure or minimal infrastructure. And you can have a circuit and operational going from that area. You can have your long-range maritime patrol going from that area. For economic warfare, for commerce protection, that's critically useful, especially if you're Britain and you're looking around the Commonwealth. The fact that they aren't included in anyone's tonnage is just amazing. Again, that Britain doesn't have more when World War II happens is more about the 10-year rule and funding issues in some of the dominions than it is about the fact that they didn't want them or they wouldn't have been useful. Build lots of small fast ships for carrying oil and ammunition. Make your aircraft carrier just a flying off and landing platform. How does avert a treaty? That's a nice idea, but small fast ships tend to not be good at high seas. I'm fairly sure that is some sort of random advert comment. Next one. Deeks 25. You can be honest. Drax's views on the burn are well known and quite blunt, possibly even brutal. I can accept that. Frankly, mine are. You see, the thing is, my views on the burn, Joffre, and Graf Zeppelin are mitigated by my appreciation of the sheer efforts they put into developing the technologies and the innovations they're prepared to do. The fact that they're all terrible and don't and actually make the other carrier far more difficult to manage and make the whole thing far more difficult is neither here nor there. They're trying, and they need to be, given a bit of a credit for the trying. But then he also has choice words about USS Ranger. I tried to be as polite as possible for that. And courageous class light cruisers that become carriers, again, me and Drac, I think, are both in complete agreement that we'd preferred the Admiral class if they had been further along to have been converted into carriers. For starters, the Americans would have been hunting for a third one to convert alongside Lexington and Saratoga, because I doubt the British would have let it go. And that would have been free, and that would have been Furious, Courageous, and Glorious replaced by, I don't know, Nelson, Rodney, St. Vincent, maybe Duncan. That'd be some cool carriers to start off with. Again, they would have definitely been far better escorted than Courageous and Glorious. Yes, lots of other nations actually involved in the sending a carrier off on a single random. I will get to that question in a second. But yeah, that was just not smart. Thank you, off license. Carl von Gasberg. E.B. Eli is famously photographed with bicycle inner tubes strapped to him in a basic flotation device. So he had the idea right. That impresses me greatly and makes me happy for his sense of safety. I'm going to go back to there. I'm actually far more impressed by Eli now. Japanese anonymous Japanese fleet air carriers also carried crater spares, usually 3 to 5, well, on paper. After 1944, not so much. German ships often had one spare plane in a crate, also intended for spares. The Graf Zeppelin famously had issues with its crated aircraft. That's why it's down to just one, and then that's gone, and it's got nothing. Not the Graf Zeppelin, the Graf Spey. thinking about the Graf Zeppelin and thinking where they would store the crates. I think, honestly, they would have needed a hangar annex, like the Joffre. You may be an amateur, but, we all start out as amateurs. It's time that makes us and time and study that makes us, well, I would find it annoying if someone said something like to Drac that he was an amateur because he hasn't got a PhD or whatever. That would seem absurd to me. My feeling is that there is a sort of level. I would argue that Drac is a professional in terms of running, as he runs the site and does all that. Professional historian, and I would argue that there is a line between amateur. I would say hobbyist, amateur, and the other line I sometimes use is a passion. So, hobbyist, amateur, and passion. And you work out where you are on that line. Hobbyist is someone who just dabbles and picks up a book occasionally. Amateur is someone who picks up a lot of books and really does read in and is really interested. Passion is someone who's not just reading, but also occasionally writing and doing other things as to share their love, to share their passion for the topic. So that's what I believe that everyone goes through those sort of levels, and then eventually they turn out a professional by some route, if they are lucky, in my view. But that's me. I'm a historian. I'm nutty. And now I do remember there was another question going on around here, which is from Deeks25. I miss it. Graf Zeppelin. I can see what they're thinking using tried and tested designs in the BF 109. The Germans were also not alone, and Ju-87 Stuka is very sensible. The Germans were also not alone in thinking a fleet carrier could carry out solo operations. Cough, HMS Courageous, cough. Yes. I can understand the point, and Courageous was going out with destroyers, and Glorious was with destroyers as well. That's a coming theme here. The picture next to me shows something akin what a pre-war battle group was supposed to be, i.e., there is a sonking great capital ship there, which has been known to take on Gneisenau and Scharnhorst solo and go, hello, you've pissed me off. I'm going to get revenge on you for destroying my destroyer pal. It's got a carrier and it's got a cruiser and destroyers. That is a very strong force. That is what is supposed to be moving around. And you don't send that force off on an anti-submarine warfare hunt. As I said, that's what you have the cruisers for. But let's consider the other scenario. If it had been a force like Force H, if there had been a battleship, let's say HMS Waspite with Glorious, and a town-class cruiser, and some destroyers, and Scharnhorst and Gneisenau turned up. What are the odds on Scharnhorst and Gneisenau surviving that one? Or running away before they get caught? You see, the thing is, if you follow the manual, if you follow the pre-war plans and the exercises and the ideas for how it's supposed to be doing it, it works. The trouble is some of the admirals involved. Oh, God. But I've been over Norway, and I've been over my aversion to one particular admiral of the period and why I don't think he should have been being used. But he was being used because others weren't available. They'd either died or were busy elsewhere. So he was used. And he might have been a fine peacetime admiral. But by 1940, he was not a wartime one. Now, I'm not being rude. I'm opening up Discord because I'm getting some messages on here, and I'm presuming from their flashing up, they are also about the videos. And so I'm going to see what they are. So, thank you to Dunrick and Cahedron for reminding me that in these videos I do have to say, I should say there is a thriving Discord community with a link down below. You can get to it. And I hope you've enjoyed watching them. I hope you found this interesting. I hope it makes you go and look up more if you're interested. There are some books in the Amazon list down below. And thank you for watching. I hope you liked, and I hope you consider subscribing. Maybe coming to Discord, perhaps even Patreon. I can hope. It pays for my books. And thank you. Have a nice day, and see you on Thursday when I have a live. And this week's live topic is I have it written down. It's the Battle of Stromboli, which took place 345 years ago on the 8th of January. So I'm looking at it on the 7th of January. A day early, but it seemed okay to me. And have a look at it. Look it up. The Battle of Stromboli. It's one of those really quite interesting battles. It's technically an Allied fleet battle. It's a good one. Anyway, thank you very much. Take care, and Happy New Year. And as you can see, co-op batteries arrived this morning, so I've now got flashing Christmas tree again. That is one of the things that happens with Christmas every year. No matter how many batteries you buy beforehand, you always run out. Take care. Bye.